My name is Paul C. Taylor. I am a professor of philosophy and African American and Diaspora Studies here at Vanderbilt University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the December Teachout on racial justice. I will offer a few words of introduction and a few words of thanks, and then I will hand things over to our panelists to get our conversation started in earnest. The first word of introduction has to do with the nature of this gathering. This is, as I say, a December Teachout. The Teachout series is the fruit of a partnership between the Millions of Conversation organization and the Racial Justice Grand Challenge Initiative, which is a project of the College of Arts and Science at Vanderbilt University. I have the privilege of being the lead researcher on the Racial Justice Grand Challenge Initiative. We are a collective of faculty members here at Vanderbilt who share interests from a variety of different disciplines, interests in racial justice and issues bearing on racial justice. And our aim in this project is to bring our scholarly resources to bear on issues of pressing concern in the public sphere, and to do that in conversation with colleagues and friends and experts from outside our campus, from the local community, from other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And I'm grateful for the partnerships that have enabled this to happen, and grateful for our panelists' willingness to join us. That leads me to my words of thanks. I'm thankful, first of all, for the support from the College of Arts and Science that funded the Grand Challenge Initiative and gave us the resources to put this together. I want to thank also the Millions of Conversation team led by Summer Ali. Without them, we would not be here. Without their support, we wouldn't have been able to put on this event, the December event, and the events to come. Without their support, we would not be able to offer you a story about the events that will come. So I will invite you to explore their website to see information about the future events. We're hoping to run one of these a month or so, and the future events will be announced in the fullness of time. Finally, I want to thank our participants. You will hear a great deal about the other faces on the screen, so I will leave that for a little later. But I want to give a special thanks to the participants you don't see, the people behind the scenes. Most of these are from the Millions team: Remzia Suleiman, Cameron Foster, Elise Burns. Without them, we wouldn't be here. Similarly, without Dr. Eric Ritter, who is a postdoc on the Grand Challenge project, we wouldn't be here. And Sophie Bjork-James, a faculty member in the Grand Challenge Initiative team, who took on some of the planning burden for this project. Thanks to all of you. Almost finally, two more things. Almost finally, it is important to say something like this. In 1832, 2 years after Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, the United States Supreme Court ruled that US states had no right to regulate native lands. Andrew Jackson, political hero of the state of Tennessee, ignored this ruling and kicked the latest phase of the expropriation of native peoples into high gear. It is important to remember that this is our history. It is important to remember that the kinds of lands that were at issue in this case are like the lands I'm standing on. It is important to remember that the issues we're here to discuss are not new. They are the foundational fault lines of our country, and that is why it's important for us to talk about them. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Claudine Taff, who is a lecturer, senior lecturer in the Department of African American and Diaspora Studies, who will moderate this conversation and introduce our other panelists. Dr. Taff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here to have a conversation about an incredibly important topic. It is my honor to talk just a few seconds about the flow of the event. I will engage in conversation with Drs. Franklin and Warren for about 35 to 40 minutes. After that, we'll have about 15 minutes left over for questions and answers with the panelists and the audience. Again, it's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to introduce you first to Dr. Sekou Franklin. Dr. Sekou Franklin is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Middle Tennessee State University. He is author of After the Rebellion, Black Youth, Social Movement Activism, and the Post-Civil Rights Generation. And he edited The State of Blacks in Middle Tennessee. He also has a forthcoming book co-authored with Ray Block called Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. He is currently the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. He resides in North Nashville with his wife and 2 daughters. As a scholar activist, Dr. Franklin has worked closely with numerous groups. He is an instructor for the James Lawson Institute, which provides training in nonviolent resistance to activists, journalists, and organizers in North America. In November 2016, he coordinated the Tennessee Election Protection Hotline in collaboration with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law and has worked on voting rights cases. He received his training in voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice's Census and Redistricting Institute and the Geodata Bootcamp hosted by Tufts University's Voting Rights Data Institute. He also served on the Tennessee Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights from 2016 to 2020, and he serves on the coordinating committee of Democracy Nashville Democratic Communities. Thank you, Dr. Franklin, for serving on this panel. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chezare Warren. Dr. Warren is an associate professor of equity and inclusion in educational policy right here at Vanderbilt. Welcome. He was a classroom teacher and school administrator before completing policy studies in urban education doctoral program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Prior to joining the LPO faculty, Dr. Warren was a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania and faculty member in the Michigan State University's College of Education. He also held a visiting appointment at Stanford University and New York University's Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. He is a scholar of race and intersectional justice with particular interests in understanding the conditions that facilitate Black boys' education success. Dr. Warren's scholarship has appeared in top peer-reviewed journals, including Educational Researcher, Equity and Excellence in Education, Urban Education, Race, Ethnicity in Education, and Teachers College Record. He is the recipient of numerous national recognitions for his research, including the 2014 Outstanding Dissertation Award from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, 2 Early Career Awards from the American Educational Research Association, and a Critics' Choice Book Award from the American Educational Studies Association. He is the author of Centering Possibility in Black Education, an urban preparation, young Black men moving from Chicago's South Side to success in higher education, which inaugurated Harvard Education's Press Race and Education series. He was also the 2019-2020 National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine and Ford Foundation postdoc and past president of the Critical Race Studies in Education Association. He has also completed terms of editorial leadership for the American Educational Research Journal, the Journal of Negro Education, and the Journal of Teacher Education. Dr. Warren, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I will let our audience know that we are discussing critical race theory as we move forward. I will use CRT to refer to critical race theory. We have some questions that we'll engage. And again, if you should have questions towards the end of our conversation, feel free to post those questions in the chat box. Let's begin with Dr. Warren. If we talk about the basics, what has been your experience studying or teaching critical race theory? And also, what are some misunderstandings and realities that you've identified regarding CRT in your own teaching and learning?
Thank you, Dr. Taaffe. Did I pronounce it right?
Dr. Taff.
Taff, I'm sorry. Dr. Taff. I know we should have practiced that before we got on. Please accept my apologies for that. Thank you for your introduction, and a pleasure to meet you both. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me in, to be a part of the conversation, especially as somebody that's brand new to Nashville and still figuring out my way here in Tennessee. I am from Chicago, and I studied at the University of Illinois at Chicago with scholars who are very well known for CRT in education. And so I think my training in CRT was really good in the sense that I was immediately drawn to the literature and legal studies, where folks started really writing about and advocating CRT. And my experience really was, I will say, I read the book Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. It was one of my introduction to the grander concept of critical race theory. And he makes the basic argument that racism is indestructible, it's permanent, that there's nothing we can ever do about it. And my very first inclination as a person who grew up in public schools, went to college, got an education, and really thought and believed in the ideal of America, get an education, meritocracy, and felt like I had achieved that. It was really troubling to me to encounter that notion of the fact that racism is a permanent feature of American society, and there's nothing that we can really ever do to change that. I've since, over a decade later, come to understand that sentiment as an opportunity to really engage and understand the world that we're living in with really clear eyes. And I think what we've seen in the last year, 2 years, even with January 6th and this sort of widespread assault on CRT is a reminder of how vigilantly folks will fight to preserve the ideal of our democracy than they will democracy itself. And I think that this is the thing that has been difficult in the teaching and studying of CRT, but also when it is, and I'm engaging folks in this conversation, we have all in many ways internalized a particular message about what America is and what America should be. And we want to believe in the promise that all men are created equal, that we should and have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, but recognize that there's a history that is a direct affront to that, and that the statement that America can never really shed its racism is really an opportunity to see the world for it is, such that we understand what it is that we need to be doing to engage this democracy such that it lives up to its ideals. And I think this is the very argument that the 1619 Project has tried to make in terms of we have a democracy, and that's because Black folks have really fought hard to make it what it said it was supposed to be. So that's the big thing, wrestling with this cognitive dissonance between my wanting to believe in the American dream and the recognition that the American dream is not really what it is for many folks in this society. And that's been the thing that I've probably had to confront most. And I think what these attacks have also done for me is it reminds me again of Carol Anderson's work in White Rage, and that anytime that there's been any sort of epoch of progress in this country, that there's also been significant white backlash, and we have to deal with where that rage comes from. And to be honest, if you always only known power and you feel that that power is being threatened, there is going to be a response to that. And I think we should not be surprised that there is a response. So I'll sort of stop there.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Warren. To our audience, at certain points, I think we'll be dropping some books and articles that kind of provide a foundation to critical race theory. Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell is one of them. Certainly works by Kimberly Crenshaw and Delgado are pieces folks should read if they're interested in understanding kind of the origins around this. Dr. Franklin, same question to you. Can you talk about your experience studying and teaching critical race theory, and then talk about some misunderstandings and realities that you've kind of identified in those experiences?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I want to thank Me in Conversations, Dr. Taff, who I've known for a long time, and also Dr. Ritter also for inviting me. And I teach courses in race politics. I'm a political scientist by trade. I teach courses in civil rights, social movements, municipal politics, race and criminal justice system. And so for me, my introduction to critical race theory goes back to graduate school, primarily through the works of Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, and the relationship between critical race theory and critical legal studies. To me, critical race theory is not really, from the standpoint of studying it from the standpoint of African-American politics, is not really controversial from my perspective, although it's controversial in the larger universe. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings about critical race theory And the biggest misunderstanding that comes from the critics of critical race theory is that they really don't know what critical race theory is. If you really were to unpack the criticisms of people who are attacking critical race theory at the school board level, then you really were to look at the state legislative, the laws that have been passed here in Tennessee, Florida, I believe Texas too. Really, they're not just attacking what we call critical race theory from the way that we learned it in the academy, maybe through Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw. They're attacking all things and everything related to diversity-based programs and anti-racism. And by that, I mean that, at least the way I learned about critical race theory is that it's an analytical lens for looking at race and society, systems, institutions like the legal system. But it's one of many analytical lenses that we can use. In political science, we look at, linked fate and secondary marginalization. We look at a whole range of analytical lenses. Some people, look at race and analyze race through mostly class-based analysis. So there's many different debates that take place among Black scholars in political science, for example, about how race and racial domination and white supremacy should and can be unpacked. But the way that critical race theory critics look at CRT is they group all things related to anti-racism, all things related to racial justice, all things related to diversity under the umbrella of CRT. And so what you find with the legislation that's being adopted, which I can talk about later on, is the legislation is very, very damaging and very, very gangster, if I use that word, that's being adopted all across the country, because it's basically making a broad attack on almost everything that one can imagine related to diversity, partly because the people who are advancing the legislation don't even know what critical race theory is.
Absolutely. Dr. Franklin, as you said, we've known each other for a very, very long time as community organizers, as well as in grad school. And I'm thinking that we both engaged with CRT in grad school, and that was a long time ago. So
yeah.
When this controversy came around, I think many of us were kind of like, wait, this has been around for really long time.
Right.
Like, why is this becoming, the View's hot topic? So Dr. Franklin, can you talk about a little bit of how did we get here? How are we in a controversial moment now, knowing that CRT has been around for quite some time?
Well, Dr. Warren hit it on the head. It is part of a white backlash in response to the diversifying of the country. If you think about, in 2008, the non-white voting age population was 25 to 27% of the population. Now it's probably 30%. In 1980, it was 11% of the voting age population. So you do have a more diverse country emerging. It was partly in response to the 1619 Project, as Dr. Warren said, a major response, in a way in which critics of critical race theory want to exalt what they perceive as American exceptionalism, this kind of shining city on the hill. And then it was injected in the middle, in the late stages of the 2020 elections. In September of 2020, Donald Trump issued an executive order called 13950. And that executive order made a very, very concerted attack to root out, dig out all diversity-based training programs in federal agencies, including the military, the Department of Labor. They tried to scrub diversity-based programs out of collective bargaining, out of the way that unions operated and threatened their collective bargaining status. And it reached and if you read the executive order, in terms of what it did, it castigated critical race theory as a malign or destructive ideology, even though it didn't necessarily name it, and it tried to incorporate this approach to this adverse approach to race, even in what's called Title VII, what's called a hostile work environment, which it gets deep into the roots of how rules and regulations are promulgated, that Black folks in particular, civil rights activists, have been very astute and really navigating going back to the 1970s. So this was injected in September 2020, and then it was captured by and taken and paired with some interest groups like the Heritage Foundation, and then of course it trickled down to the local level, to the school boards. And so this is kind of part of a broader attack, a backlash, as Dr. Warren mentioned, against our folks. And it's really being propelled by a deeper set of beliefs. And those beliefs are that among many whites, that whites are being replaced by persons of color, the so-called replacement theory. And there's some research about this that's out there that many whites who are against critical race theory believe that they are the new N-word. They are the new subjugated group. There's some research out there by Bruce Bartlett, who wrote an excellent summary of this. And there's also a belief by many of the critics of critical race theory that American exceptionalism, as they see it, quote unquote, is under attack. And so all of this has come together at this moment of time.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. Dr. Warren, do you have anything to add in terms of how we literally got to this moment?
Yeah, I think there is, if we think about the Obama election and what that signified for people in terms of the country having made all of this progress on race, and people started throwing around the language of post-racialism. And then you have all of these deaths that get televised. And then you have all of these Black folks now who are engaged in social movements. We live in a technological age where information gets passed at warp speed. And I think that there's been growing accountability from folks who have been historically at the bottom of the racial order to hold this country accountable. And part of what we are seeing is a sort of building frustration by those who have only known power and only known themselves to be centered in the world, now having to confront the fact that that racial order is being threatened. And I think what we're seeing is partly responses to that. And part of what critical race theory, like any good theory, is supposed to do is to explain and help us understand our world more clearly. And interest convergence is one of those perspectives that come from the critical race theory umbrella of intellectual perspectives that really is intended to just simply help us to see race and its significance for shaping various sorts of outcomes and disparities in our country across the range of the indicators of life, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion is really good if it does not threaten people's positional authority or any sort of institutional power structure. It becomes really problematic when it forces folks to have to concede an authority that they have only known forever, right? And so I think there are so many different ways that we can talk about and think about the position of where folks think that they are now losing a hold. And when you talk about not talking about race and not talking about the true history of the country, like, let's just mute that and leave it, undiscussed. What that is also saying is we want to just keep forward the American ideal and never have to contend with who is exploited and continues to be subjugated to keep that American ideal sort of going. So the conversation that I'm having with my students is, we talk about freedom and liberty and justice for all in the pledge from as early as you can remember, but that costs, and who has to pay that cost more often than not? And to have to be thrown into that sort of tension, it's really tough for people. And I've done this with 17 and 18-year-olds in the first year seminar on race and multiculturalism. It's like, I've not been taught this history. What am I going to do with myself? So I think, young people can feel really disempowered in some ways to get this history, but I think folks with power are leveraging that power in the ways that they know how, and legislation is one way to do that.
Absolutely. And so coming off of that keyword legislation, let's bring the conversation home to Tennessee, an interesting state. Dr. Franklin, can you talk to us about the specific attempts around kind of teaching critical race theory in Tennessee and then maybe nationally? But there's been a lot of brouhaha in this state. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, well, it's debatable whether or not any of the schools before this debate ever took place actually taught what's called quote unquote critical race theory. Many of the school districts, even those that have people who believe in racial justice, claim that they never actually taught quote unquote critical race theory as a standalone distinguishable issue. They may be taught issues, stuff about race and Blacks and Latinx and stuff like that. But what the state did in May of this year was the state did pass a law banning what the state called the teaching of critical race theory, CRT. But if you read the law bans the teaching of issues related to race and diversity. So, given as an example, if someone wanted to talk about something as maybe non-controversial as the life of Colin Powell and how did Colin Powell become a general, and Colin Powell, you had a military that was segregated up until right before the Korean War, and you had Colin Powell who may have been a beneficiary of diversity-based affirmative action programs in the 1970s, and lo and behold, he becomes a general. That kind of story, which would be celebrated on Fox News, is a story that could literally be banned based upon the reading of the letter of the law in Tennessee that was adopted in May of 2021. The law, of course, is problematic on many grounds. The lawmakers claim that they fast-tracked the law in Tennessee and other states because the Biden administration was offering a very small grant to school districts that wanted to have diversity-based education, broadly defined, really kind of non-controversial grant. And then the critics of critical race theory, I think Moms for Liberty or whatever these groups are, they claim that they don't want critical race theory taught, particularly to people who are in elementary school. But if you look at the law again, like I said, it attacks all diversity-based related issues in Tennessee. And then what the state did was the state didn't really know how to enforce the law or manage the law, so they promulgated rules to administer the law under the Department of Education. And those rules that they promulgated are even worse. Because what it does, from my perspective, is that it gets into the psychosocial realm and emotional realm of students. So the student feels that they are being affected emotionally by the discussion of race and diversity. Then it gives parents a trigger for filing a complaint, right, against that particular area district. And then also related to that is possibly the loss of some funding. But the rules are so complicated that, from my perspective, if there was a resistance against those rules that was organized, then the state would have very difficulty managing those rules. I just want to make sure if I could point out just a couple more things related to that. Along with the state law, school boards themselves have adopted some procedures against critical race theory. In Sullivan County, they pushed out a teacher as well. Rutherford County and Williamson County, we're seeing all across the state an anti-CRT movement that, from the standpoint of white racial resentment, so to speak, it does have power to mobilize them, or is having power. But what I want to say is just that also that to put this attack on critical race theory in the lineage of the attacks against desegregation in the 1970s, the way that it was able to, that was tied to mobilizing white racial resentment around elections, white Christian academies emerging as a response to the civil rights protests. But also more recently, I do want to point this out as my last point. Even before the emergence of this attack on critical race theory, the state legislature made a move to attack diversity-based issues in the public schools. Just one example that I had a personal experience with at my daughter's junior high school at Hume Fogg, and that Meigs, that the curriculum at the school was teaching an equivalency between the Confederates and the Union Army. Right. They, in other words, if you taught about General Grant, you had to teach about the Confederate general, and you had to teach them as if both sides had chivalry, both sides had an equal point to make, and both sides stood on kind of high moral ground, so to speak. So this was already being kind of pushed in Tennessee schools, this idea of an attack on diversity, attack on racial justice, those kinds of things.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And to see this all kind of happen in real time is absolutely fascinating. Dr. Warren, do you have anything to add in terms of the national context? And also, what do you think these attacks on CRT really mean?
Yeah, I think in the national context, this feels like an attempt to maintain and preserve an ignorance about race that will leave people unawares of the ways that they continue to be implicated in sustaining systems of power and oppression that, on the surface, liberally speaking, no one would ever want to take any claim to. And part of the work of any good theory and any good research is to help us to understand and see our world in ways that move beyond the superficial. And I think, as Dr. Franklin pointed out, nobody's teaching CRT. Those of us who studied it know doggone well that they are not reading any law review articles and teaching this theory in K-12 schools. That
Right.
being said, it is not a bad word to talk about racism and white supremacy. That feels bad because, again, it threatens all of the ways that we've been socialized to appreciate from as early as we can remember. Saying the Pledge of Allegiance is a way of creating patriots, right? And creating young people to consider themselves to be the luckiest people in the world having grown up in this country. And what critical race theory is simply trying to do is to sober us. And for folks who have learned it and now is attempting to take some of that consciousness and make it available to young people, again, it feels, I think, really threatening to people who only know what it feels like to be the center of attention and to be average. And what I also find curious is that for folks who occupy any position of power, we have to question, and I'm thinking along gender, sexuality, race, whatever it is, when we say, we start talking about women's issues or queer issues or Black people's issues, that does not mean we're anti-straight or anti-white or anti-right Christian. How is it that we can say we really care about all kids or all people being represented and feeling cared for and seen, and at the same time feel threatened when we offer points of view that are counter to what it is that we've always known and believed about ourselves and about the world? That's a way of growing. And so I sort of see this as an attempt to sort of conserve this ignorance. I think about Jennifer Mueller's work and an epistemology of ignorance, where I can actually know the truth and choose to remain willfully oblivious to the ways that I'm participating in systems of oppression. And that's what folks, I think, are coming after.
Absolutely. And I know we're talking about this, I think, more kind of in the realm of the grownups, right? And it's uncomfortable. It's certainly uncomfortable when you start to learn a different narrative, right, than what you've known kind of growing up. I started in early childhood to a professor in terms of my teaching. And so let's bring it into the classroom. Let's talk about the curriculum. What's happening with our young people? What's going to come of these attempts in terms of kind of changing up or trying to kind of demonize, right, or police these conversations? Why does it matter what the curriculum is? And where do you think we're headed? And let's start with Dr. Warren on that point.
Yeah, this is another really, I think, pretty big question. When I think of curriculum, I think of knowledge, and we know the adage of knowledge is power. And we want some people to remain empowered and others disempowered. And so when I think about, on the one hand, similar to you, Dr. Taff, I was a middle school and high school math teacher, and you expose young people to perspectives that they didn't have before, and you can see the light bulbs go off and they feel empowered to engage in the world in a way that they didn't before. That's why we teach, right? Because I think historically schooling, and I think this is important for the audience to know, Black folks have always cared about an education, right? And we know the consequences during chattel slavery for Black folks who wanted to learn how to read.
Right.
Following emancipation, one of the first things that Black people did, if not the first thing, was to open our own schools and advocate for public education. mass public education. But white supremacy is going to be white supremacy in the sense that it is going to adjust itself in any ways that it can to make a thing always serve its purpose. And so we also know that school for many of us has been about get the facts, regurgitate those facts, don't actually become a critical thinker, because to become a critical thinker means that you are exercising agency and autonomy over the direction of your life. And that actually is not how America works. Everybody has a particular place and a station that they occupy. And schooling has been the mechanism by which to maintain the social order. And what curriculum does, and pushing back and expanding the stories that get told, is that it invites young people to actually engage with dissonant perspectives, to then become the sort of critical thinkers that we say we want, that they can then go out and own the world in the ways that they want to own the world. And it means something to invite a young person to reason with the world, as Carter G. Woodson talks about, reason with the world as they find it, and then decide how they want to engage it in service to whatever their commitments are, political or otherwise. So I think this becomes really important, because even white young people will grow up and they may then encounter their first Black professor right in my classroom, and I'm having these conversations with them, and they're thrown at 18 and 19 into a space where they now don't know how to engage with the people that they're sitting across the dinner table with. And I think we're doing them a disservice if they only get this information once they get to college. And I think because there has been a growing interest in infusing these perspectives as early as primary, to start to talk to kids about difference and to really engage them, because they do have thoughts. We are doing young people a disservice, because they're just going to grow older and eventually really come to see the world. And I think it just creates more animosity and conflict.
Absolutely. Dr. Franklin, you mentioned your daughter. What does this mean? What does all this kind of back and forth mean for our kids in the classroom?
It's going to be a tough road ahead. I mean, it depends upon the context. In some respects, if you're at a maybe majority Black school, if you're at a school that has some activist students there and those kinds of things, and there could be a lot of pushback to it. And we kind of come out of a history of freedom schools and everything like that. So there are ways in these environments that have maybe majority Black environments or students that are activists, so to speak. There's ways in which it could be countered, and there's things that teachers can do to do that. But there is definitely going to be in more insulated wide environments, or parts of Tennessee, for example, where Blacks are not a majority, or Latinos are not a majority, where the anti-CRT folks are doubling down and they're going to triple down. One example again is in Sullivan County. I believe a teacher, I think, had students maybe reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, and that student was effectively pushed out for citing that. So you're going to see definitely those kinds of attacks that oftentimes based upon the context and depending upon what schools they're in. You're also going to see, I think, some teachers are going to withdraw from having more poignant discussions about race, even if it's at a stealth level. That is, even if there's not an official crackdown on them, people are going to be more tentative and cautious about talking about these issues in the class. And then again, if you look at the Tennessee law and you compare the Tennessee law with the executive order that has since been revoked by Biden, but the executive order that Trump dealt with, one dealt with the workforce, the other one dealt with education. They're pretty similar. And one of the things that they're encouraging, in this case, the Tennessee educators to do, is to make a concerted attempt, that is the Tennessee lawmakers, to concerted attempt to exalt what they perceive as an exceptionalist narrative of America. And by that, they're making the argument that teachers should be concerned about teaching about the greatness of America, and that slavery and racism and sexism and homophobia and capitalism, these are like anomalies that the American exceptionalist character has adjusted quickly to and has resolved. But the real goal of teaching and education should be to teach about the greatness of American character. Don't even talk about these other issues as if they're constitutive of the so-called youth tradition. And that's in the actual law that they want educators to really focus on. But we're headed into a serious fight here in Tennessee. The Virginia election was an example. These local school board elections are an example, because the right wing is betting on the idea that that the anti-CRT movement, that it can mobilize voters. It is as much of a wedge issue as busing was, as much of an edge issue as the desegregation campaigns. In some school districts, there was a fight over teaching English as a second language. This is a wedge issue that has political power for many of these local state areas. And then when you combine that with restrictions on voting rights, and gerrymandering, they're counting on that this could be a potent force.
Right. And so I'm so glad you brought up freedom schools, right? So in all transparency, you and I were, organizing around bringing freedom schools back in the early 90s. And so, historically, education and voting were really at the center of what freedom schools were doing and are still trying to do, right? I want to go back, and I guess I want to take a bit of moderator privilege to kind of reinforce what Dr. Warren was saying around education, just historically being so important to African Americans. Clearly, when something has been kept from you, then you know how important it is. And I think we all kind of understand too that we're talking about a particular kind of education then ends up being good for everybody, right? Not just for Black people. And in terms of resources, there are certainly folks that are doing and have been doing incredible work around what CRT means in the classroom, right? So Adrian Dixon, Gloria Latson-Billings, David Stovall, folks who've been kind of doing this work for years. And if folks are interested in kind of what does this mean in terms of K-12, certainly seek out their work. In terms of our kind of final question, how can we have meaningful conversations with people in our kind of circle, right? Our community, our family, our coworkers. How can we have meaningful conversations about this controversy with folks? And either one of you can answer.
Yeah, I think, on the one hand, I'm like, all human beings want to be, heard and seen. But I'm also like thinking about the ways that if you identified as Black, you're not even read as human. So that's a whole nother thing here. But I think that there is an opportunity to call folks in to really urge our white colleagues and counterparts to have conversations with other white people. I've said this before, really racism is white people's problem. It's not really Black folks' problem. I think the thing that we have to be contending with as Black folks or as people of color in any historically marginalized community is really tending to the well-being of other folks in our community. I think that there's a conversation that we need to have separate with folks in our community about these issues, as separate from colleagues we need to have across the aisle in terms of a political affiliation, racial, gender difference, and so on. And I think it's also important to say in these conversations that being racist is very different than being called racist. One is far more consequential. This is not identity politics in the same way that being patriarchal or being heterosexist is very different than being called one. You have an opportunity to be different and recognize how you're participating in somebody else's oppression or disadvantage, and then to make a decision. I think implicated that we also have to contend with is the legitimate emotion, on the one hand, the deep anger that people feel when they are called out for doing things that sustain somebody else's oppression, and then they act out by, writing this sort of legislation. It's beyond human, I think, comprehension in terms of an evil, right? But I think we also have to recognize that folks are going to bring an emotion, that these conversations are going to be emotionally charged, and that's okay. Like you're going to be angry, you're going to be sad, you're going to be frustrated, you're going to feel guilty, you're going to feel shame. Lean into all of that emotion. I would say all of that emotion is necessary to then decide I'm going to do something different. And folks have to be okay being called out and called to task. Because I think, again, I much rather be called something than be the thing that I'm being called. And I want to be actively working to be different than what it is that I'm being called out as being with respect to maintaining somebody else's oppression. So.
Absolutely. Dr. Franklin, any kind of suggestions for how we can have this conversation, particularly for folks that haven't probably engaged with CRT in the academy in the ways that we were, or in community organizing in the ways that we are? Just kind of, how do I have this conversation with my auntie?
Well, I try to find the stories that could be the tie that binds, if that makes any sense. So stories that maybe, I hate to say non-controversial, stories that you're able to find more of a consensus around, and use those stories as a way to say that this is an attack against CRT. And that's why I mentioned that that Colin Powell story, because it's, and not to exalt Colin Powell, I have my criticism of him, but it's a linkage story. You can, I tell my, if you ask, why is it such a big deal that Colin Powell was a general? Well, because, Black folks at one time weren't allowed to the senior ranks. Well, because the military was segregated. Well, because Black folks were not given the amount of supplies in World War II. Well, A. Philip Randolph then had to threaten Truman that he was going to lead the Brotherhood of Sleeper Car Porters for protest. And by the way, Colin Powell said that the reason why he was able to transition up the ranks was because of an affirmative action or diversity program during the Jimmy Carter years. So in that one, Colin Powell, and by the way, he's from the Bronx, but the Black folks from the South, weren't allowed to transition into the senior ranks of the military. So in that one Colin Powell story, you move it from this kind of exceptionalist, cable news TV story into a story that looks at labor and affirmative action and the presidency and education. And so I think, those linkage stories that are more common to people, UT Knoxville, Bernard King went to UT Knoxville. He was attacked by police there. That's the athletic story, so to speak. Labor folks. Oh yeah, Trump had an attack on collective bargaining or labor organizations in his executive order September 2020. So if we want to, find ways, kind of these creative ways to narrate the story, then it might be important to look at more commonly, common ground stories that could perhaps serve as linkages between maybe the academy or us and people like our family and friends.
Absolutely. And the reason I'm asking, particularly around how do we have these conversations, as I kind of think about where we are right now, right? We're coming up on the midterm elections. We're coming up on 2024 elections. And so there is a linkage between what's happening in these battles that are supposed to be battles just in K-12 classrooms, policy and voting. So what are those linkages and why is this important as we move forward toward the 2022 and 2024 elections? I think some people would think, well, policy, K-12 education, voting, that's not connected, but in some ways it really is. What are we facing here as it relates to critical race theory? And either can answer.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt about it that in the 2022 midterm elections, probably if there's some success in the 2024 presidential elections, this CRT debate is going to be front center. It will be the prism in which race is navigated on. So we just can't, we have to develop creative acts of resistance and strategies to address these issues. But then again, when you pair that with the very kind of wholesale attack against voting rights and a federal court that is that has shifted to a very, if you talk to people working in the federal court system on voting rights, for example, the new judges that have come online the last 4 or 5 years, I mean, they're off the chain. So this CRT issue is going to be front and center. And the Virginia election has provided a signal to the right that they can use a CRT to mobilize white voters and to mobilize racial resentment.
Dr. Warren, and I'm also thinking particularly around high school students that are going into college, going into that kind of voting space. What information is being kept from them while they're in high school and then they become voters? What are we facing here?
I think the only thing that I'll add is that when I'm having these conversations I do a lot of work with teachers around the country who are trying to be better about race, right, in schools and school districts. And I always lead with nobody in the room, your parents, your grandparent, nobody that we know and can touch created the systems of white dominance and racism that we all now have inherited. But we do now have a decision to make about how we engage that system. And I think in that way, the ways that people personalize conversations around race, where if I'm talking about white supremacy or the histories of white dominance or redlining or anything, any particular policy initiative, the GI Bill and all the ways that it created white wealth, white folks can sometimes immediately implicate themselves and be like, you're talking about me, so this is about me. No, everything's not about you. We're talking about a system. No, you didn't create it, but we have to do something in response. So I think we have to be able to talk to folks about how we're engaging in a world that we did not create personally, but that what are our commitments across the board? Do we or do we not want poor people to make a living wage or to be able to come up? Do we or do we not want queer people to have equal protections, right? As heterosexual people. If we say we do want these things, what does that take and what does it cost? How are you implicated? And this is nothing that you can do on your own. It has to be something that's done collectively. And I think what the right has done, the alt-right, we talk about Charlottesville, we recognize social movements have a lot of power. Political solidarity and collective organizing has a lot of power when people who are at the bottom pull resources together to push back and resist. Things can progress and change, but we also got to recognize that other folks are going to take those same tactics and use them against us. So I think we just have to bring that to the fore and make that known that these are systems, and systems only come down when groups of people decide. So, and so in that way, it's not about a personal thing, right? We got to kind of get over the me part of things and think about what's going to be the condition of us if I don't do something different.
So talk about us, right? So how do we push back against this defensiveness about teaching about the past and the reality of the past, right? I think when I teach my introduction to African American studies, I always say to my students, we need to complicate this history, right? That these figures were complicated. Jefferson was complicated, right? The founding of America was, well, in many ways it was cut and dry, right? It was about slavery, kind of engineering this, economic system. But, we have to complicate these moments, that it's not just kind of, forgive the word, black and white. So if we think about folks who are resistant to having these conversations, and we want to think about, okay, how can I have them see what's in it for them, right? What's in it for all of us to teach the past in the way that it needs to be taught? What would you suggest?
So two things are coming to mind. I'm thinking about something that Dr. Franklin said a little earlier around sharing a sort of shared, or finding a sort of shared condition or something. Everybody has a motivation in life for whatever it is. Particularly, I'm thinking about folks have particular identities that anchor them, that drive how they engage with the world. It might be their faith, it might be their gender or whatever. And I think being able to talk about race in relationship to these other hierarchies of oppression and the ways people sort of move in and out of them, I think is part of getting people at least to a space where we can understand the issue, even if you don't have it in you or the capacity to really, agree or go along with it. Because I think if you've been socialized over time in one way, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time for you to want to do something different. But the other thing that I'm thinking about is, how do we inspire young people? And this is what I'm thinking about. There's a great book that was just published by a colleague, Jarvis Givens, called Fugitive Pedagogy. And I think about the ways that Black teachers would take Carter G. Woodson's work and read it and put it inside of the mainstream curriculum, but teach young people from that book, from Carter G. Woodson's work. How do we build movements of young people who will push back against school districts, who will push back against state legislatures? I think about Black Youth Project 100 and an organization called Voice in Chicago. Young people who are Chicago public school students who are going to state legislatures and saying, no, this is what we want. And this is, if you say you're doing this on behalf of kids, we are the kids who you're talking about. I wonder how it is that we can be more strategic about inviting young people who want to engage in this sort of fugitive space of learning and inviting them to lead the way in terms of pushing back against these larger structures in ways that teachers and those of us who are in some ways feel really beholden to or are tied up in the institution cannot. You know, I think about even on a college campus, students don't always know how much power they have on our campuses to push the campus to be different and be better. So how do I have conversations with my students behind closed doors in outer spaces, away from the institution, to inspire their thinking about how they might engage in these systems from the bottom up? That's what's immediately coming to mind, but there's no easy answers to that question.
Well, we actually do have a question in the chat. Can we think about how COVID-19 amplified this white backlash? Either can answer.
Well, I do think that the pandemic and the ability of the same forces that are at the forefront of the anti-CRT effort there's an alignment with those forces that are anti-vaxxer, anti-masker. I can almost tell you that, and I would bet whatever little money I have that the future political science studies coming out in the next decade will be able to empirically measure that. And along with that is an hysteria that the world is changing, fueled by conspiracy. So I would probably make that conclusion. Yeah, prematurely at least.
Well, now we'll look forward to the research. How do you think COVID-19 has just amplified all of this?
Yeah, what I know from the education reform literature is that we know waves of big education reform happens as a result of spectacle or disaster. One prominent example of that is Hurricane Katrina, and how it is that now New Orleans is almost a fully charterized school district, and that was an opportunity to leverage resources and political will to move an agenda forward that did not necessarily have young people or Black educators at the center of that agenda when trying to advance it. So these types of moments of like calamity and chaos create opportunities for people with a lot of power to sort of advance an agenda that's significant and important to them. So certainly, I think COVID-19 and all of what this has meant for restructuring and changing our world, folks have just taken advantage of the moment where there's a lot of precarity and a lot of vulnerability. And that vulnerability along multiple spheres of life was revealed during the pandemic. You know, folks started to be like, okay, racial capitalism is actually a thing. Infrastructures have never really worked for us. Right. Yeah, Black folks have always known that, but it takes these things to sort of reveal it, and folks leverage it.
Right, and I also wonder if COVID-19 is kind of provided that opportunity where folks need to sit down, right? And when you're sitting down, you have you're in a position to listen more and kind of observe more. We've all had to sit down, and I think we've all had to also think about certain things in the midst of grief and loss, right? And and what meaning all of that has. Before we close out, I do want to mention some comments that are in the chat. Outside of the school world, CBOs can empower youth and assist them with opportunities to make their voices heard. All of the moves that Dr. Franklin cited, voting rights, CRT, are part of a orchestrated effort of those on the right who are feeling threatened, not to see it as intentional and planned, being able to confront it. I am full. I think I am absolutely learning more and more every day. Not maybe what CRT is, but how we can all work collectively. I do actually still believe and have a measure of hope in saying that when we make this good for all marginalized communities, we make the world good for all of us, right? Always trying to kind of figure out what's in it for all of us, right? So please, thank you so much for having this conversation, Dr. Franklin and Dr. Warren. Definite thanks to Millions of Conversations for allowing me to moderate this conversation. This is race, racism, African-American studies, young people, voting are issues that are very important to all of us. And so I want to thank everyone for spending their lunch hour with us. I wish everybody wellness, be safe, be well, be kind, and we'll see you at the next conversation.